Gracias.
No. So, people, remember that. A ver, let's go back to. We have started discussing some ideas in relation to developing grammatical competence. Do you remember that? So we discussed the traditional way in which grammar has been taught throughout many years, and we started discussing this so-called grammar in 3D, which is a kind of new approach to the teaching of grammar. So we distinguished the differences between a focus on forms approach, or forms with the S here, which stands for the traditional way in which languages or grammar has been presented throughout history, let's say, right? Then we also discussed this new version of, or this new change in focus, which has to do with a focus on form without the S, in which language is presented as a whole, but when there are instances in which a focus has to be done on a particular form of the language, the idea is to do so, right? But the starting point is not the isolation of a particular structure, but rather dealing with meaning, and then when or if necessary, resorting to the analysis of the form of the language. Then there is another approach, and we have discussed this in our last lesson, which has to do with a focus on meaning only, right? That is, students being exposed and getting a lot of input in the target language, with the idea that getting that input is enough for students to be able to understand, store, and then retrieve the language later on. Then we compared these two different approaches, the one with a focus on forms and with a focus on form, and you get the main points here. In the traditional approach here, students practice isolated grammar points. There is a focus on form rather than on meaning. Language is generally decomposed into bits and presented without a context. And when we work without a context, it is more difficult for the students to understand meaning and use of the new item presented. There is no attention to real language use, and students have a passive role in the sense that it is the teacher, the one who decides what to present, how to present it, and generally it is the teacher who, or the one who explains the rules of the language. Whereas following a focus on form approach, students get the whole of the language. They can use whatever they have at their disposal. The starting point is a focus on meaning rather than on form, and form is worked on or analyzed later on. Language is presented in context, and this gives the students the possibility of understanding not only form, but also meaning and use, which are important components if we want our students to be able to internalize and then use the target language. Tasks resemble real-life communication. This has to do with this has to do with the idea that language should be a vehicle by means of which we communicate, right? So if we include in our lesson plans or when planning decisions, if we only include activities for the students to practice the form of the language, it is going to be more difficult for them to be able to use the language later on. And then this idea here that the students have an active role as opposed to the structural approach, in the sense that they are the students, the ones who get the input. From that input, they may make hypotheses about how the language works. They analyze, they try to infer the rules, and they use the language also. Okay, so these are more or less the ideas that we discussed last class. Also, this question of noticing and renoticing, structuring and restructuring, in the sense that the main idea when the focus is on form without the S has to do with the importance of the type of inputs the students get. That is, being exposed to a lot of inputs in which particular forms of the language are used, students will be able to notice that, to incorporate that new form of the language, and in their mental networks, they will be able to structure and restructure the system all the time. So I think this was the last slide we shared last class, and this has to do with some input-based techniques which we need to take into account if we want to, or if we want our students to focus on the form of the language and not just isolated bits. So there are different techniques which have certain things in common that are mentioned here. They make a certain form salient to the learner. This means that from the inputs the learners get, which has to do with the whole of the language and not just isolated bits, there will be something salient that will call students' attention. And we will see this in a minute, examples of this in a minute. I mean, something from the inputs focus their attention on a particular form of the language. And from there on, the students will carry out different processes in order to understand, store, and later on retrieve. They require a more introspective engagement with language and quiet observation on the part of the students. So we somehow decentralize the role of the teacher. In this case, mainly the teacher will be the provider of inputs, and it will be the students' tasks to carry out different processes, right? They do not demand explicit reflection on language rules, with the idea that if there is a lot of information in the inputs students get, and many instances in which a particular bit of language or a particular structure is presented, the students will not require the teacher explaining overtly what or how this particular bit of language works. And they do not necessarily result in production of the grammar features under analysis. I mean, there is not a quite direct relationship between getting the input and producing the bit of language later on. Some processes need to be undertaken in order for students to be able to do this. Is this more or less clear so far? Yes? Okay. So one of these input-based techniques is called input flooding. This means exposure to meaningful input flooded with examples of the target form. As a certain form is more frequent, it becomes more salient. This means providing students with lots of instances of the new target form. Because there are lots of instances, the idea is that the students will be able to notice that and to analyze the regularities of the language because of the many examples or instances that they get. So, bueno, there are some examples here that I don't know whether we are going to have time to analyze, but if you get the presentation later on, you may have a look at these different activities and you will realize what input flooding stands for. But the idea is that there are many instances of the target form that we want our students to focus on. And because there are many instances, they will realize that there is something new there, and they will also realize eventually how a particular form of language is formed, if we are talking about grammar mainly. Clear? Well, you have here 2 pages with examples, right? And let's pass on to the other technique. So the first one is called input flooding, and that means providing students with lots of instances of the new target form. In this case, this technique is called input enhancement. So, strategies such as capitalization or printing in boldface are used to make features in the input salient. The learner may not notice the input enhance, or else what is perceived as salient by some learners may not be so by others. So the idea with this input enhancement technique is that there is some kind of attention that we are forcing students to pay attention to. Bueno, salió horrible, pero that's more or less the idea. If you have a look at this story or this film review rather, there are some words that are like highlighted, right? That is, from the whole of the text, some words are within a circle, and the idea is that or those items should call students' attention because there is something around them that makes them salient. Do you see the point? Yes? So the idea is that, well, probably after working with the meaning of this review, the idea is that the teacher can direct students' attention to those words which stand out from the rest of the article, right? And then probably some kind of analysis or reflection on the part of the students helped by the teacher will take place, right? Okay, then consciousness raising. Consciousness raising stands for or means that we should draw learners' attention to the formal properties of the language. So these type of activities involve isolating a specific, just a second, I think there is someone in the waiting room. Let me see. Ah, you have admitted her, Belen. Sorry. Flor has also joined us. Hello, Flor, how are you? Bueno, so isolating a specific linguistic feature for focused attention. What does this mean? A ver, you tell me. Are you there?
That is maybe more related to structural activities, because the linguistic features are not presented in context, but they are isolated, and the whole attention is directed towards that linguistic feature.
Okay,
maybe.
But the idea here is, you're right, Emma, but the idea here is that first you work with the whole of the language. And from that context, you isolate a specific structure you want your students to focus on.
In a kind of a top-to-bottom matter?
Sorry?
In a kind of a top-to-bottom approach, I'd say.
Yes, from the whole or from general to specific. If we were talking about just a structural approach, there will be no context. There will be just the isolation of a particular structure per se. In this case, and because these type of activities are called consciousness-raising activities, we are speaking about working with the whole of the language first, and then isolating particular structures that we want our students to pay attention to. But because these are called consciousness-raising activities, we are talking about activities in which it will be the student's task to pay attention to the regularity of the language or the regularity of the form, to infer rules, and so on and so forth. Do you see the point? We are not working directly as a starting point with an isolated structure, but rather we are working with the language as a whole. We are working with meaning first, and then we isolate a particular, the teacher helps students isolate a particular structure and work on that, right? So have a look at this second point, providing data which illustrates the targeted feature and the possible explanation or description of the explicit rule of that feature. So the idea is that you provide more than one instance, and from the many instances students encounter, they will be able to overtly infer the rule, right? Using intellectual effort to understand the targeted feature, further clarification in case there is misunderstanding or incomplete misunderstanding of the grammatical structure. That is, the type of work that you can provide students with by means of this consciousness-raising activity activities is more related to guiding students towards discovering rather than the teacher directly explaining. Do you see the difference? So here you will see, or you will probably understand how this can be done. This is an example from a textbook in which students have a look at these activities that the students have to carry out here. Identify, consolidate, identify, hypothesis building, checking, reconstruction, deconstruction. I mean, a kind of work on the language which is derived from a particular context, by means of which the students will be able to notice the type of input they are given, make their own hypotheses, infer the rules, and so on and so forth. Is this more or less clear?
Yes.
Yes? Okay. Bueno, there are some more examples here. Holidays in which there is a particular emphasis on the analysis on the form of the language. And then here you will also get some other examples of some other types of activities which can be included within these consciousness raising activity types. Is this more or less clear?
Teacher, I have a doubt.
Sí.
As regards those consciousness raising tasks, is
Sí.
it okay to mark, for example, I don't know, imagine we are teaching the simple present. Is it okay to mark in bold or in different letter DS or something like that? Is it a good strategy to help them to notice the grammar, or that is not consciousness raising?
Well, that is part of the technique we have discussed some minutes ago, called input enhancement. So the idea is that from those words or structures or parts of structures that we have highlighted, the idea is to design activities in which you help students raise their consciousness in relation to that. In your example, in relation to the S, for instance.
Right. Okay.
But if you pay attention to the name of this activity type, it is not an activity or a task in which students have to fill in the blanks, for example, because there is no consciousness raising there. These consciousness raising activities should be activities in which you guide students towards discovering what that S implies, for instance. Instead of you telling them directly with isolated examples of the structure on the blackboard, for instance. Do you see the difference?
Yes.
Okay, good. Good. So, then, the aim of teaching grammar as a conclusion, ay Dios, siempre me tienen que llamar por teléfono, I'm sorry. The aim of teaching grammar implies internalization of structures for later use in communication. This internalization will be more memorable, and might imply more chances for students to use the language later on if we adopt or if we follow this focus on form approach. Yes, that is, instead of presenting grammar in isolation, we present it in context. Oh my God. Can you just wait me for 1 second, please?
Yes.
Marisol. Ay, espérate que estoy en clase. Ahí voy a buscar la tarjeta. Espérenme un segundo, chicos. Espera, porque estoy acá abajo. I'm sorry. We were talking about this idea of students internalizing the structures so as to be able to use the language later on. Ay, no puedo así. Just 1 second. Tengo que hacer una transferencia. Espérenme un segundito, por favor. Okay. Can you hear me now? I'm sorry.
Yes, we can.
I'm sorry. Tenía que pasar unas coordenadas para una transferencia en la facu. Perdónenme, chicos. No es la clase ideal esta, pero bueno. That's what we have. So let's go back to the very first aim of teaching grammar. Internalization of structures for later use in communication. So the idea is that we help learners internalize the rules of the language, but not just by telling them directly how the language works or how one particular structure works, but rather guiding them by means of input flooding techniques, input enhancement techniques, consciousness raising activities, guiding them towards discovering on their own. Remember that also from last year, we are always talking about the idea of language learning as a memorable process, in the sense that if the students are more active and if the students discover and if the students infer the rules and make their generalizations, they will be able to store that more effectively, and eventually they will be able to use the language for communicative purposes more effectively also. Clear? Okay. So yes. When dealing with the complexity of grammar, 3 dimensions must concern us. Structure of form, semantics of meaning, and the pragmatic conditions governing use. So again, if you have a look at these words here, we have form, we have meaning, and we have use, right? So the idea is we are not saying that we do not have to pay attention to form. We do have to focus on form, but that should not be the starting point, yes? And we should not work with the form of the language in isolation, because that will lack this work on meaning and use. Is this more or less clear?
Yes, maybe the hard focus on form is presented in that input flooding of flooding, because there are
Yes.
many examples of the same structure, and then the job is on the part of the student to focus on that and try to get to a rule by their own.
Yes, but and you know why? Because only one instance of an isolated structure does not give you the possibility of any analysis. I mean, you cannot derive a rule from one single example. In order for students to see the regularity of a particular form, they need to see many instances in context. Yes?
Yes.
Okay, so if the session finishes, we reconnect again. Teaching grammar in 3D implies offering students opportunities to see the whole picture of the language, that is, following a FONF approach, making grammar stand out from the page in all its relevant aspects: form, meaning, and function, using input-based techniques and consciousness raising, which will result in implicit or explicit learning. Letting students have an active role in the learning process by encouraging noticing and structuring so that they can build their own system of the foreign language. Okay, less than 1 minute, let's reconnect and we discuss this last conclusion, right?
Right.
Okay.